another episode of Dog Talk. Today, I want to talk about dog food, and that is a conversation that I have with many of my clients. It comes up for a variety of reasons. A lot of people ask me what my opinion is on the food they're feeding their dog. They've heard what their vet has to say. They bought it because it looked good in the pet store and they didn't really look into it too deeply, or someone else feeds their dog and they started doing it. So when they have a chance to talk to someone else who works with dogs and sees a lot of dogs, they usually ask. Sometimes I bring the conversation up if I see a dog in board and train that we have here, where the stool is too soft or too light or too mushy, and it's just the consistency is right, but the protein's probably off. So I usually bring it up and we talk a little bit about food quality and what the different options are on the market and what to generally look for. And then often I offer them to help find some food if they're interested, and that usually helps with figuring out how to get the digestive system of the dog in better shape. So there's a lot of things that go into dog food. So I want to touch on a couple of those basics for the commercial foods that are out there. And these are my personal opinions, and you can research yourself all you want and decide for yourself what you want to feed. But these are my observations, my opinions, and some things are just some simple facts about what certain things are like. And then I also want to talk about a little bit how I feed my own dogs and how I got there, and what I've seen with that, because that's been quite a remarkable and eye-opening journey. Spoiler alert, I feed raw at this point, but there was a journey for me to get there, and I didn't just fall out of a tree and decide I feed raw. So there was a reason I started this, and I want to talk about this a little bit and what I'm seeing with that and why I think that's the way to go, if it's affordable and you want to go through the effort. But let's go step by step. So let's start with commercial dog foods first. There's obviously a whole range of them, and the price points of those are go all over the place. There's cheap and expensive. Just like with our food, cheap is often not the greatest because the ingredients are not the greatest. So the better dog foods will cost more. The general thing I think that you should just keep in mind overall is that good food and healthy food will keep your dog away from the vet more. So you will have fewer issues down the line, fewer health issues. You probably can avoid a lot of vet bills. I personally do avoid a lot of vet bills with my dogs. I mean, they have to go every once in a while, but there's not a lot wrong with them. It's usually little ailments here and there that they caught somewhere, but it's not anything related major to their digestive living situation and the digestive system and the water supply and stuff like that. There's a lot of things you can control in terms of health that do make a big difference in the long term health and longevity of your dogs too. So my last two shepherds, Sylvester was 17 when he passed away, as a German shepherd, and he died peacefully in my home. And then the other dog who's passed away, Max, he was 19 when he passed away. He's also a German shepherd. And I rescued him only when he was about 8. So, so diet does have an impact, just like it has with us. It has with our dogs. That's just a fact. So how you go about then getting the right diet, you can debate lots of things, but feeding good quality food is important. I think that's pretty self-evident overall. Feed the best food you can afford is usually the best advice, and there's some things you can do to improve it. And there's all kinds of nutritionists out there and health advice out there that can guide you and help you facilitate that journey and improve food as you go. And it's all worth listening to and taking in and reading more about each advice you get. Don't just take anything at face value, what I say, what anybody says. Just if something interests you or you find something intriguing, research a little bit more yourself on this topic, see what others have to say on this specific point, and then form your own opinion based on that. But let's start with some of the commercial dog foods. So when you look at a dog food bag, there's on the back of that bag, there is something called a guaranteed analysis. And these have to be accurate by law. So this is the one thing on the back that has to be accurate. Everything else can be a marketing scheme, but guaranteed analysis has to be accurate. Now, the things that are in there are only the things that are required, again, by law. Things that are not required by law, will be omitted. So the things you find in there is fat, protein, moisture, and ash. Those are usually the things they supply to you. Sometimes ash isn't listed. And carbs aren't listed because they don't have to. But with the information they give you, it's easy to figure out what the carbs are. And the carbs are kind of important because the carbs become sugar upon digestion, just like with us. So potatoes, other tasty things upon digestion become sugar. And too much sugar is not good for you, and it's not good for your dog. So when you add the numbers up that are listed on that bag, so you have protein percentage, you have a fat percentage or moisture percentage, and maybe you have an ash percentage, maybe you don't. But you add up those three numbers, and let's say ash is missing. In that case, you would just estimate it. So a good estimate of ash is 6%. Sometimes it's less, and better food is less, but that's basically burnt residue from processing. So estimated 6%, add up the numbers. On most foods, oh, sorry, I forgot one step. Add up the numbers and then subtract that number from 100. And then you get what the carb content of the food you have at hand is actually about. So with most dog foods you buy, most commercial foods, will be very high on the carb scale. 50% is not unusual. So most dog foods are between 45% and 55% in carbs. This is high. It's a lot of so it's 60% or 55% of the bag is sugar. If 55% or 50% of every meal is sugar, you see where that goes with us pretty quickly. And that's not good. So in terms of long-term health and longevity, feeding 50% sugar, I think is pretty obviously not a good idea. You want to bring that down. So there are some better foods on the market, but obviously the price point goes up. So my personal, in terms of kibble, two of my favorites are Arcana and Origin. Both of them are made by a company called Champion Pet Foods from Canada. And the food is available now at Petco, but not at PetSmart. So PetSmart is not going to get this. But Petco has them in the store. You can also get them on Chewy, get them on PetFlow, which is another online provider. And you can buy them on Amazon, although I would not necessarily recommend you do that. I personally like Amazon a lot, buy lots of stuff there, but their warehouses are hot. And when you have hot warehouses and you store dog food bags in there, that's not a good combination. So the freshness of the food suffers if they sit in hot warehouses for a long period of time. So I would avoid dog food purchases on Amazon just for that reason, because the warehouses are known to be hot. I know a couple of people who work there, they also say it's hot. I've never met anybody who said they're well climate controlled. So just from a storage perspective, maybe not the best place to buy back dog food. But yeah, little side note on that. So as I said, I like Arcana and I like Origin. So Origin is the one that we have in the home as a backup food in case we can't feed raw for one day or we need some extra kibble for training or something like that. We want to use something high quality. So we always have some Origin in the house. And the Origin Regional Red, which would be something we can feed our shepherds, is, I think, 26% of carbs only. And that's a really good number. It's really low compared to the average of most bags, which is in the 50 percentile range. There are some decent foods out there, like From's has generally a good reputation for food, and certainly not bad food, but their carb content is in the 40 percentile range. So from a carb perspective, over the duration, long term, that's a lot of sugar. So I prefer lower sugar in terms of feeding in general, because that's just too much sugar is just not good. Now, if you look at what dogs would eat, if they could have access to whatever they would be eating, just like wolves, they would be eating a diet that is more comparable to their genetics, which is generally speaking high in fat, medium in protein, low in carbs. So a kind of ketogenic diet, basically a 60% fat, 35% protein, and 5% carbs is a great diet for a dog. But that requires you to actually feed raw. You will not get this in any other format. But that has benefits and advantages because it's the more natural way of feeding or eating for a dog per se. And when you look at the ingredients in food and how it's made, and there's like a lot of these foods, they are run through what's called an extruder. Kind of the same thing they used to make the Czech cereal. That's the time it was invented and was repurposed. But that cooks up the food to like 300-400 degrees. So it kills a lot of the nutrients from the meat and vegetables, whatever they may be putting in. So whenever an extruder is involved in making the food, you're not dealing with quality afterwards, even if quality went in, because it's all been cooked to death. If you cook broccoli too long, it loses all its vitamins. It looks pretty nasty after a while. It's no longer this crispy, nice green vegetable. It becomes like a really bland-looking mush. And at that point, it's probably not worth eating anymore. But that's the same thing. So if there's too much heat, obviously destroys nutrients. Also pretty straightforward. That's not a controversial thing. So commercial dog foods are made often with this extruder device, and then things are cooked to death. And then sometimes they're, again, fortified with other vitamins and supplements that they write on the back and put in so they can list them as ingredients. And then there's some standards from the American Feed I think it's American Animal Feed Association or so on, what the minimal nutritional requirements are. And all the commercial foods have to meet those minimal requirements. And they're kind of like the thing that you can also look with our food in terms of FDA requirements. If you just eat what the FDA says is the absolute minimum to stay alive, you're probably not going to grow to be very old, because just eating the bare minimum of what it takes to survive is not going to be a guarantee for longevity and health. We know that in us, and if you follow any kind of nutritional advice, generally from well-known, respected human nutritionists, you'll learn what forms of vitamin D and how much of that you should probably supplement on a daily basis, and what the FDA has to say about that is not really getting anywhere near that. I'm not even sure D is on that list of what the FDA wants you to have. But so the bare minimums that standards like the Feed Association say for dog food, they will be met by all the foods, but that's not the most ideal way of thinking about food. Right? So just having the bare minimum to not die is probably not the best of criteria for choosing what you should be eating. So just picking better foods result in obviously more nutritional ingredients, less destruction of the ingredients in the production process, and obviously that costs more money, and more meat costs more money. So the price goes up as the quality goes up with dog food. That's a pretty straight correlation. Now then you have, of course, very specific types of dog food that the veterinarian sells. A science diet is one of them. You find the vets, and they have the vet formulas for the science diet. There's also Royal Canin. There's, I think, some Purina veterinary diets, and some Royal Canin. I think Eukanuba, I think, has some veterinary diets. And they cost a lot of money. So should they be good foods? You would think so based on the price tag, but if you think they are great foods, I would suggest you pick up one of those bags that the vet sells and take a picture of the ingredients, and then sit down on your computer and look at those ingredients, look those up, and maybe talk to a canine nutritionist about what they think of those ingredients, because they're pretty atrocious. When you look at what a science diet bag, for example, costs and what the ingredients are, there's not a correlation that really makes a lot of sense. I mean, it makes sense for a great profit margin, but it's not that there's a lot of high quality meat products included in those foods. So take a look at labels, read the ingredients. It's similar with us, like the first couple of ingredients is the main ingredient. So if that's not all meat, well, what are you buying? What are you paying for? So you want to get food that generally contains a lot of meats, or poultries, or fish, or whatever is ideal for your dog, because the best diet is breed specific. The best nutrition is breed specific. So that's a couple of things to keep in mind. So when it comes to commercial kibble, the ones you buy in specialty places like a veterinarian may cost a lot, but may not necessarily provide with the same quality. So for the amount of money that vet-provided food costs, you can buy some pretty high-quality food in a pet store that will have more nutritious content, will be healthier in the long run per se. Just looking at the ingredients. Now, one other thing on this, actually two other things on this I want to touch on real quick with veterinarians. I don't mean to hammer them too much on this, but it is something that just sticks out. So the food that they have usually has hydrolyzed protein. And that's a selling point because hydrolyzed protein can be good for addressing certain health conditions. So for example, if a dog has irritable bowel disease, IBS, or irritable bowel symptoms, we call IBS. And hydrolyzed protein would be one way to potentially address the nutritional challenge that you face, or the feeding challenge you face in this case, because that's something serious. The dog may not absorb nutrients, the dog may not absorb enough calories if they have this disease. So you have to feed specific things to make that work and make sure the dog stays healthy. I have actually a client who has this. And that is, hydrolyzed protein is one way of going about this, but it's not the only way. So if you are in a situation where a veterinarian tells you, well, you need hydrolyzed protein for this and that reason, it is worth researching if there are other options and if those other options may be better or not, because there is a profit motive involved in selling you hydrolyzed protein that isn't necessarily in the best interest of your dog. That doesn't mean that your vet is trying to really screw you over on purpose. They may not know better. They may just really think that what they have there is fantastic, because nutrition is not part of a veterinary curriculum to the extent that it would be with a canine nutritionist. So a canine nutritionist knows a lot about food and nutrition and how to formulate foods for dogs, while a veterinarian is more trained in diagnosis and treatment and medications, and nutrition is taught in vet school, but not anywhere near to the extent that a nutritionist would be taught in that. So it's very limited in their understanding, just based on their education and background. It's just not part of becoming a veterinarian to become a nutritional expert. It's just not part of the curriculum. Just like dog training isn't part of the curriculum of a veterinarian, so there's just no education in their very intensive and complex and difficult studies. I mean, it's difficult to become a vet, don't get me wrong. It's just like, you gotta have respect for that profession and for what they can do. And my own vets have saved my dog's lives on occasion. So I absolutely respect vets, don't misunderstand me. But in terms of nutrition, they don't have the most knowledge. There's way more knowledgeable resources out there than a veterinarian when it comes to nutrition or training. So it's just not what they're being taught in vet school. It's not a main focus. So hydrolyzed protein is one option, but a novel protein could be another option. So in case of my client, it was diagnosed while the dog was with me, because I actually saw there's something wrong. The dog was eating a lot, but was never putting on any weight, and there seemed to be something off. So I suggested that I'll take the dog to the vet while it was boarding with me, and she said, yeah, let's do that. So we did, and that's the second part of what I wanted to bring up. The dog had a bowel issue, and one of the remedies would be hydrolyzed protein. But also the other option would be a novel protein. So novel protein meaning something not as common. Right? So like venison or lamb or deer or something like that, which bison. You can buy all these things today. Because so many dog foods out there with so many different proteins you can get. So you can find all kinds of things. So you can try proteins that your dog may digest better because they're just not used to them. They have never been exposed to bad versions of them. They're just new, and they may have a better time digesting them. It may address the issue. And in case of this specific client I'm thinking of, it actually did address the issues. It was a good move to a novel protein. But what I experienced at the vet was, when they came in, described the symptoms, we drew some blood, did some testing. We had no results at the first visit. Obviously, we have to send them into the lab and get feedback. We didn't know. There was a speculation. It may be this, but it wasn't known at this point. We were waiting for the test results. But before we had even test results, that vet tried to push their science diet hydrolyzed protein food on me, my client's dog, 3 times. I mean, it was pretty intense on how much they were trying to sell this. So she first tried to sell it to me in the room. We had no diagnosis. We had no idea what's wrong with the dog, and she wants to put him on this food. And the food the dog is eating is of much better quality than what she's trying to push. So it's much higher quality food. So that was the first time. And then on the outside, the vet assistants came out. Yeah, we have the food on here. I said, no, I'm not taking the food. And she like, oh, okay. Then she went back in and the vet came back out to try again. And then after the vet talked to me, the vet assistants came back and wanted to know, we're taking the food now? I said, no, we're not taking the food. So it's like they kept coming up with the food. It was just like, wow. I mean, if we had a diagnosis and they really think that's the way to go, okay, that's fair. But before you even know what's wrong with the dog, you want to switch out the food to something that may or may not make any sense. That makes literally no sense whatsoever. So that was just a very interesting experience and quite eye-opening because I'd never seen it to this extent. I've seen vets suggest the foods they sell. I mean, obviously they want to sell what they have, but I've never seen them push it this hard before. So with this particular dog, I ended up doing what I do, which is like digging in, trying to figure out what else is there. Is this the only option? And it's a viable option to use hydrolyzed protein, no question. I'm not disputing it is. It is. But in this case, hydrolyzed protein would be the only decent ingredient in that food she suggested, and the rest would be just crap. So that's not a good idea. So there are some alternatives to these kinds of vet foods that you now can get from Just Food for Dogs, which is now available also at Petco in the frozen section. So this fresh cooked food that's frozen. So that's a different option, and it's worth exploring. And then novel proteins is worth exploring as well when you have certain conditions, if they pertain to what your dog has, and in our case it did. That's obviously not for all conditions where hydrolyzed protein is the answer. So you have to look at case by case. It's just this particular thing. There were other options that would result in much more nutritious food and much better quality food than what the vet's pushing on me in this particular scenario. But okay, so that's a little side note on food and what's out there. So you're gonna get sold a lot these days because selling food is apparently quite a profitable thing for veterinarians. It didn't used to be a thing 10 years ago. Now it's a big deal. So it happens a lot. But it doesn't necessarily mean that's the way to go. So just research, look at the labels, read the labels, figure out what food has the least amount of carbs in it, and also do some research on what should your dog actually eat. So we have some information on the website where you can read for how much you should feed a dog and how to figure out what your dog should eat, kind of things. There's lots of things that go into that. The best way really is to hire a knowledgeable canine nutritionist and spend the one time a couple of $100 and get a custom recipe with the ideal ingredients for your particular dog. And then even if you don't end up cooking this or making a raw version of it or whatever you end up getting made from a nutritionist, you at least would know what ingredients to look for in a dog food bag. So if you really want to figure out what the best food is, that is money worth spending. A couple of $100 to have a nutritionist figure out the best food for your particular dog. Or if it's purebred, it's easier. If it's a breed mix, a little bit more work. But a skilled, knowledgeable nutritionist will be able to do that. There's master's degrees in this stuff now. And so that is so far beyond what veterinarians are being taught in vet school. So canine nutritionists are really knowledgeable people with a lot of background in nutrition and knowledge. So it's absolutely worth hiring one and having them make a recipe for your dog if you really want to optimize it. And then with that recipe, you can go buy a commercial food if you prefer it, but now you know what to look for, which are the ideal proteins for your dog, which vegetables to use, which vegetables not to worry about, or which, same with fruit. So I think something I sometimes give as an example is this. Some high quality foods may say organic blueberries on the label. That sounds great, right? But are blueberries valuable nutrition for your particular dog? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on your dog. So what understanding that will help you evaluate ingredients on dog food bags also, because before you spend money on organic blueberries in dog food, understand if that's worth doing for the dog you're trying to feed. For one dog breed, that may be great. For another dog breed, that may be useless. I mean, it's not going to be harmful, but why spend money on things that you ultimately have no health benefit? You're trying to buy food that's healthy for your dog and provide the best nutrition for your dog, so you don't want to spend money on unnecessary things because the price goes up as you want better quality. So spend the money on the things that actually accomplish that outcome. So that's on commercial dog foods. Maybe one other thing, there is something called the petfoodadvisor.com or .org. I think it's .com. It's worth signing up for that because they have all the recalls. They will send you an email when there's a food recall. There's a lot of recalls on dog food, and it's good to know when you're having a recall issue with the food you buy. There is some dog food brands have never had recalls, but there's very few. For most of them, most even good quality brands, most of them had recalls at some point. And I mean, it can happen. It's commercial food production. So the dog food advisor is something I get emails from, and they tell me about what the recalls are. You can just go to the website once a week and look what's out there. But there's always something. I mean, not a month goes by when you don't have some serious recalls on dog food somewhere. So knowing what they are is good to know if you buy commercial food, so you can stay on top of that. So the last thing on this whole, on commercial food, there's one thing I just thought of. I want to include this. And some of you may be familiar with this, some may not be. But a couple of years ago, like 2-3 years ago, there was this big FDA warning came out. All of a sudden, out of the blue, nobody saw it coming, nobody knew about it. Boom, there it was. We have found that dog foods that are grain-free may cause heart disease in dogs. You should feed only, here's a couple of foods, and you should avoid these foods. There's a couple of foods. And the list of foods that the FDA in this announcement recommended were not the greatest, but they're the biggest commercial food brands. They're just not necessarily the best quality foods. But they were very big names, all the big names. And the ones to avoid were a lot of niche foods, but are very good quality niche foods. Or they're not even so much niche anymore, but they're just like smaller companies, and they have more nutritious and more customized options. But a lot of them were listed as an issue. And that's a very specific thing to be doing for the FDA, that there should be some serious data to say don't buy this food and buy this food instead. So it baffled a lot of people, it baffled a lot of veterinarians, it baffled lots of researchers, because where's this coming from? And then it began. So the investigation began of what was going on there. And what was going on there was that dogs had developed heart disease from a taurine deficiency. Taurine is an amino acid. And that apparently seemed to be the underlying cause of the issue. Now, there were 500 reports of dogs being affected and developing heart disease. A lot of golden retrievers, apparently. 500 dogs is a decent number of dogs. But we have 81 or 89, something like that. Let's go with a smaller number. Over 80 million. Over 80 million dogs in America. Over 80 million dogs. And 500 developed an issue. Not 50,000 or 5 million, no, 500. So whatever is causing this is clearly not a mass problem. So that's the first thing. There's something, I'm sure something going on, but it's not really a massive issue that affects the majority of dogs, and there's a higher level of risk all of a sudden, because the number never really went higher. So now researchers and holistic veterinarians, Dr. Gene Dodds was one of them, who started gathering the research and looking into this and starting updating consumers very regularly about what we learned and what we knew. And that went on for about 2 years, because the answer was hard to find. And we still don't have the exact answer. But what most likely happened, and I'm getting back to why this is important with dog food, but what most likely happened was this, that some dog foods, not all, but some, that were grain-free, replaced the grain with other ingredients, like tapioca starch, pea protein. These are very common things they would put in instead of wheat or potatoes, things like that. But instead of wheat, they would put in these other protein, these other carbs, replacements basically. And a combination of those is apparently a big part of the issue. Because taurine itself is something that dogs make on their own. They don't have to be eating that. There's 2 amino acids that they need. I forgot what those names are, but those amino acids allow the dog to make their own taurine, and that provides heart health. So the foods that the FDA has listed as problematic, one of them was Fromm's. And I said Fromm's earlier, it's not a bad dog food at all. Carbs a little high for my taste, but it's not a bad brand. But Fromm's is one of the brands, I think the only brand actually, that fortifies their dog's food with taurine. So for a dog food that is fortified with taurine to cause a taurine deficiency in a dog is literally impossible. They're literally putting it in there on top of everything else. So how could that be a deficiency as a result from eating it? So that right there didn't make sense. So if a taurine deficiency is the cause of the heart disease, and there's a food that's fortified with taurine, can't possibly be the issue at this point. Unless taurine absorption is blocked somewhere, but that was never investigated. So most likely scenario still is, because we still don't know anymore, and the research stopped at this point because it was really interesting research, but it was never a mass problem that killed millions of dogs left and right, or even affected their health left and right. It was really a very, very small group of dogs that reacted poorly to apparently having the formation of taurine blocked through a combination of these wheat replacements. And we still don't know what this combination exactly is, and we still don't know exactly what happened in blocking the taurine production. That has not been answered. I'm not sure it will be at this point, but we're like 3-4 years later now total, and that has never been resolved as an issue. And millions of dogs have been continuing to eat the foods the FDA thought we shouldn't be feeding anymore, which were high quality foods, and they are thriving on these foods. So it was very questionable how this all came together, and it's baffled people for a long time. And about 2-3 months ago, there was investigative journalistic write-up, and I will post that. I have that somewhere. I will post it in the show notes, that explained how this most likely came together. And it comes down to some of these massive pet food companies that were recommended bribing FDA officials to put this out because the niche brands were cutting into the profit margin. So that takes us obviously to a completely different level than dog health. Now it's a completely commercially motivated interest that led to this whole thing. So there's been some not so stellar activity apparently on part of the watchdog agency and certain companies and so forth. So it's an interesting article to read, and there's still more unanswered questions. So it's not like all questions have been answered in that context, but I encourage you to read it. I will also post the write-ups from Dr. Jean Darts in the same article because they're super interesting. She outlined how all of this was analyzed, what the research was, what the studies was. She updated everybody. I think there's 3 or 4 blog posts that she had over this time frame. So I will put all of those in the show notes. At this point, there's no risk of buying any of those grain-free foods. Grain-free foods are fine. There's just nothing that you have to worry about. But it's interesting to read if you want to geek out a little bit and dive in. It's a certainly interesting thing that happened with commercial kibble. So it's the most interesting thing that I've come across in my time training dogs. So that was quite fascinating, the whole thing. So, but back to healthy food. So what do I do personally is what I want to get to also. And so we fed originally kibble, and I wasn't very familiar with dog food, and I didn't know much about it. And at some point, I decided that I want to improve food quality in general because I began to read more about the health impact. And we had 2 dogs pass away in the past of cancer. And that was the first two dogs ever, and they came with my ex-wife. I didn't. I met them very late in life, but she was in charge of feeding them. She always took care of them, and I liked them a lot. But I wasn't involved in buying their food at this point. I wasn't a dog trainer. I was had a corporate career, and it was just not something I was involved in a whole lot. But I then saw what happened with the food that we purchased and fed these dogs. And once I got my first own dog, so after we were down to one, and he was 16 at the point, it was Donut, great dog. But once we were down to one, I could get my own dog, and I wanted to feed differently. So that's when it started. So I wanted to feed my dogs better food than was commercially available. So I decided, let me cook for my dogs. And I looked around, and I found a canine nutritionist. His name was Dr. William, I think Doctor, William Cusick, and he called himself the Animal Advocate. He had a wonderful website up where he had excerpts from his nutritional books that he wrote in the 90s that he also gave away as PDFs for free on his website at this point. And he started making custom recipes. So custom breed-specific recipes. So he talked a lot about the different nutritional needs that each individual breed has. Things they may be allergic to, things that may be good for them, things that may be bad for them. And that does make a lot of sense because we have the same thing. So we respond to certain foods better than others, depending on the region we're from and the region we're grow up in and the things that are available to us. And there's historical reasons for all of this. And there's nothing right or wrong about any of it. It's just there are nutritional differences between different ethnicities. There are nutritional recommendations for different people from different ethnic backgrounds. So you find in a lot of African countries a lot of lactose intolerance because traditionally there is not that much milk being used in the way it's being used in the West in colder climates where it's easier to store. I mean, now we all have refrigerators, not an issue. But if you go back historically, outside temperature was a big problem in certain areas. So certain things were difficult to do unless you started digging into the ground and quite cooling spaces underground or in caves or something like that. So over like a long period of time, each part of the world has developed people that have different nutritional needs to some degree. I personally, I can't digest rice all that well. Potatoes aren't a problem at all. My ex-wife was Asian. Rice was not a problem for her at all. Rice morning, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, fantastic. I could not eat this way. My stomach would just go in rebellion. So I even noticed this in our home with nutrition and preferences one way or the other. So it made sense to me that there would be differences in breeds based on where they're from. And so I bought a recipe from Mr. Cusick for my German Shepherd, Sylvester. The best diet for a German Shepherd. And I cooked from him basically from day one. After I rescued him, I was ready to go. Everything was basically going. I made the food before I even picked him up from his surgery. So he ate that food from day one. And he ate that food, and my other German Shepherds did also, that cooked recipe for many years. 5, 6, 7 years, something like that, long period of time. Before I started investigating raw diets. And when I got into, and they did fantastic on the food. There was no observable problem. We had a couple of allergies that developed over the time that fed this. So there was a wheat allergy I had to deal with, and wheat was part of his diet. There was also it's not an allergy, but I think it was food-based. But anyway, so it was great food, worked well. But then, over the years, I was a dog trainer, seeing a lot of people feed dogs, and what they eat, and read more and learn more, and go to seminars, workshops, read books. Right? The things you do in the profession you're in, you learn more about the species you're training. So I learned more and more about nutrition and health, and naturally came to raw feeding. So I didn't switch my dogs over at this point, but we rescued a dog through my German Shepherd rescue named Nico. And Nico was originally suspected to have degenerative myelopathy, or DM. It's a hereditary disease, and it's basically MS in dogs, or multiple sclerosis in dogs. And there is not really a cure. So the nerve endings kind of degenerate, and just goes down the hill from there. That's a little bit background. There is a lot more to his story, but I don't want to get into this too much. But do this DM thing, and this time when we thought he had DM, one of the things that was recommended in all the things I read was putting that dog on a raw diet to slow this down. And we had enough funding through donations to try something like this, so we did. So I looked at commercial raw diets at this point, and I ended up with Barf World. Horrible name, great food. So BARF stands in the raw world for a bone and raw feed. BARF. Poor naming. But BARF World makes really great raw food. There's others out there. There's lots of companies out there now, but they have in their food not sweet potatoes, but russet potatoes as part of the ingredients. And for a German Shepherd, that's a better potato. Just basically having the recipe from Kusik and just knowing what they should and shouldn't eat, and how well my dogs did. I just knew what to avoid and what not to look for. So there's other raw foods have sweet potatoes in them, and with German Shepherds, they're not that great. So we went with that, and he didn't have DM, but I could see for the first time in my own home how a dog responded to raw food. And it was just a marvelous thing to see. And it's just him loving it so much. The way he just devoured his food. I've never seen. I mean, my dogs like their food and they love to eat it, but this guy was like unstoppable when it came to, wow, what is this? This is like the best thing ever. And then I saw the health effects on him. I saw how his coat changed, how his overall demeanor was better. I saw so many positive health benefits that are clearly associated with the food change we made, because there was nothing else that we did at this time. I said, wow, there is definitely something to raw feeding. So while I didn't want to abandon my custom recipe because it was really the nutritional perfect balance for German Shepherds, I did want to switch to raw. So I wanted to make this transition. And so, me being who I am and what I do, I sat down and did a full nutritional analysis on the custom breed specific German Shepherd raw cooked recipe I had, and that took a while. And the spreadsheets are just something else. So, but that's me. So I had this, and then I got myself a book on raw feeding, which is called Unlocking the Ancestral Diet. $20 or something like that on Amazon, and it's a very good book to introduce you to raw feeding, and gives you couple of recipes, gives you a couple of ideas on how to customize and tune it and change it up and mix it. And I analyzed basically one of that recipes in there that I thought would be a good mix for a shepherd based on the proteins that they had in there, and did a full nutritional analysis on that. And there weren't any like real discrepancies in terms of, well, there's something here my dog shouldn't eat, but there was some things missing. So now I balanced out these two nutritional analyses into the raw diet. So I customized the nutritional profile onto the raw food. What that resulted in, after 3 months of work, was now a custom breed-specific raw food for German Shepherds. And then I made that first for Nico, because I wanted to see how he would respond to this changed food. It's the first time I made raw food myself, actually. And that's certainly cheaper than the commercial raw foods, because you have to buy bulk and make it. It's going to be cheaper. And I did this for a couple of weeks. And it was just, he loved it. There was no downside. You didn't see any it's not benefits, but I didn't see any health side effects, no negatives at all. He was just doing fantastic. And then we took him back. I think I took him in for a blood test again to just do an analysis, see how he's doing. And blood was great. So that was a validation that that is a great diet, a great raw diet to feed German Shepherds. And so we started making it for all my dogs, all my German Shepherds. And that's what they've been eating ever since. And that's been now, gosh, how long has that been going now? I started this in 2019. Well, I started making the food in 2018. That's when I analyzed the whole thing. But at some time in 2019, I think like in April or March, I also started this process of doing this and feeding my dogs this way. And now we're making this video here in the end of 2022. So this is 19, 20, 21, 22. It is over. It's like 4.5 years now that we have our dogs on custom raw food for German Shepherds. And it's been remarkable to see how they do on this. It's remarkable to see how their coats are, how everything about them is. They are overall very healthy dogs. They rarely have to go to the vet. They have no real issues. I mean, you get an ear infection here once in a while, or you have a fatty tumor, or you have a cyst, or so. I mean, stuff like that happens no matter what you do, right? But these are all harmless little things. They're not really like big issues. Vet takes care of that. But there has been nothing serious with any of my dogs over this entire time of first cooking and then raw feeding. It's just been a remarkable thing to see. And as I said initially, my dog Sylvester lived up to be 17 years old. And my German Shepherd Max lived up to be 19 years old. And these are not normal numbers. So most dogs die at a younger age. So these are differences that are clearly indicating there is something to raw feeding. So that's what I do personally. And I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, and I know some people don't like the idea of it. I get all that. This is more about kind of outlining what I do for my own dogs, why I'm doing it, how I got there, what I personally see. So I'm 100% behind raw food at this point. To me, that's the way to feed a dog. And whenever somebody, I often mention and suggest it, but if someone doesn't want to, I don't pursue that further. I get that. It's not everybody's cup of tea. There's other things that will be quite good. Nothing will be as good, but there are things that are very good where you can still feel good about feeding that. And in terms of kibble, like I mentioned earlier, Origin and Arcana, Origin in particular is as far as kibbles go, a fantastic kibble. The first 17 ingredients of Origin Regional Red is meat. It's just meat. It's great. I mean, you look this, there are no fillers in here, are there? That is something else. Right? So it's a really great ingredients in some of those high quality foods. So that was a lot, but hopefully it's interesting to some of you, and maybe gives you some food for thought, and maybe read a book on raw feeding. There is something I signed up for because I want to learn more about food formulation. There is a website from a canine nutritionist, and her I forgot her name, but the website is called Raw, Fed, and Nerdy. Raw, Fed, and Nerdy. It's a cute name. But if you type that into Google, it'll come right up. And she is a canine nutritionist who can actually formulate food for you. So she has I think she has a master's degree or a doctorate. I think she's even working on a doctorate in canine nutrition at this point. But she has fantastic information. It's very detailed. It's a great course. If you're into raw food, it's worth exploring. You don't even have to pay her if you don't want to. She asked for $50 to be part of the internal group and get some more things and talk to her a little bit in the internal Facebook group. But you can get everything on there pretty much for free if you don't want to pay $50. But it's well worth the $50. You should pay the $50. That's money well spent. But yeah, that's one nutritionist you could contact to get a custom thing made for your own pet, especially if it's a mixed breed. It's harder. The German Shepherd is pretty straightforward, and with certain other breeds, it's pretty straightforward once you know what they should eat. It's a lot of work, but it becomes very doable if you know how to go about it. With mixed breeds, it gets tricky. I've done it for a client once, and we had to tweak a little bit back and forth, but it's a lot of work. I mean, it's really, you're better off paying a professional. It's like when you pay a plumber to fix something in your house, an electrician, right? You pay the professional to have the work done right, and then go with it from there. So that's on food. So that was something on kibble. It was something on some of the specifics with the vets, something with degenerative heart disease that we had a while ago, some personal stories, cooked food, and then commercial food, raw food, and explore raw feeding if you're in for it, if you're up for it, and you'll see remarkable differences in your dog health-wise. You haven't seen a dog truly come alive until you give them raw meat. That is truly something. It's a sight. It's something to see. Which reminds me of one last thing before I tap out here. So one of the criticisms that, or worry, I should say the worry, that people have with raw food, it's not that they don't want to, often it's sometimes they're worried that the raw food will make their dogs ill. Because there was actually a study done not too long ago with chicken infected with a Campylobacter. I think it's Campylobacter. If I may get this wrong, but it's Camp or something, bacterium, which is found in chicken, raw chicken, next to chicken meat. And the dogs that were fed this in this trial, they were regularly eating kibble, but then they got some raw chicken infected with this, and they got sick. So that then, look at this, you can't feed raw, dogs will get sick. So that is a very selective way of trying to evaluate that. So here is another thing. I'm also going to put this in my show notes. The last thing I'm going to link there. So the Dobbs one, the write-up on the investigative journal, this thing, and then this is the last thing I'm going to put. And that is what happens when you feed a dog raw food for a period of time. And this is a link to a veterinary website. This is a veterinarian. So it's not somebody who just made this up yesterday. These are actual veterinarians who will tell you what I'm going to share with you now. And that is, once a dog eats a raw diet, after about 15 days of being on a raw diet, the dog's stomach, the pH, the acidity in your dog's stomach, will return to its natural state, which is 2.0. So the acid level in a dog's stomach that eats a raw diet, or that scavenges out there in the wild, or eats what it normally would be eaten when he's out there, would be 2.0. When we feed kibble, when we feed our commercial foods, that changes, becomes more like our stomach acids, be very different. So, but when the dog is in its natural state, stomach acid-wise, Campylobacter cannot make him sick. Neither can E. coli, neither can Salmonella, because all these things will literally die in the stomach acid of a dog that has a regular raw diet. So if you feed your dog a consistent raw diet after 15 days, you're basically in the clear. As long as you feed a raw diet. If you feed a mixed diet, you'll probably never get there. You'll have to feed like a raw diet all the way, and also your treats should be in that category. You should really buy things that are not too far off from that. I mean, freeze-dried liver and heart and lung and stuff like that, that's fine, as long as you don't overdo it. But you gotta keep the majority of their food raw to not lose that. But as long as you do that, your dog's not gonna get sick from any of those things. They're just gonna die in their stomach. If your dog is a kibble eater, yeah, all these things can be dangerous. Your dog can get sick from E. coli, your dog can get sick from Salmonella, all these things are problems. So again, if you do it consistently, the risk will go away. Your dog will be safe from eating, even if you have an infested piece of meat, and hopefully you don't, because you can buy high quality meats and the risk for getting something that's not okay is very low. But the big poultry companies and the big meat companies, the stuff that you're familiar with from the supermarket, they got recalls for Salmonella, they got recalls for E. coli, I mean the salads and stuff like that. So there's regularly recalls on human food, so it's not that it can't happen. Right? But once your dog's stomach pH returns to 2.0, you're basically in the clear. So there are some interesting things out there, and this last piece was from a veterinary website, so I'll link that as well. It was not my personal opinion, it was some holistic vets telling you this is how it goes. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. I hope that was of interest to some of you, and it was a long podcast episode, but food is something I'm very passionate about, and there's a lot I could say even more at this point, but we're going to stop here. But yeah, healthy food makes a big difference, and feeding good foods to a dog makes a big difference. And I know everybody who's in dog sports feeds their dog often raw. That was a weird sentence. Everybody often. So everybody I know in dog sports feeds their dog raw because they want their athlete to be at optimal performance level, and raw food gives you that, right? So sled dogs eat a raw diet. I mean, they eat thousands of calories a day when they're out there in the Iditarod running their races and having a blast in the snow. And they do have a blast in the snow. It's not. It's a fun thing for the dogs to be doing this kind of stuff. But all the dogs that work like in these high level capacities, they eat better food. They eat high quality food, and whenever it's possible, they will give the dogs the raw diet because that will ensure that they have the maximum performance level. So there's other benefits to that when you work with professional dogs and in certain areas where the performance actually truly matters. With a pet, for most people, it doesn't matter that much, but when you have, we train service dogs here as well, so the performance does matter. You need to have a dog to run at their optimal to do certain things, and feeding the right kind of diet is definitely a big component of that. Okay, so I hope this was helpful. This is it, and hope you get something out of it, and I'll see you next time. Bye.